The boy noticed the cold before anyone else admitted it was different. Each morning, when he stepped out of the sod house with his breath already white in the air, the wind felt sharper than it should have been. It slid along the ground instead of lifting away. It stayed. It pressed against his legs like a warning that refused to speak plainly. His name was Eli Rowan, and he was 16 years old. He lived at the edge of the valley where the land folded inward and the hills leaned close together, as if the earth itself were trying to listen. His mother said the place had once been chosen for shelter. His father had said it was chosen because no one else wanted it. Both things could be true. Eli worked the land with his hands, his back, and his patience. He did not own much. A small plot, a half-finished shed, a sod house patched more times than he could remember, and a few animals that mattered more to him than most people ever understood. There was Moss, the shepherd dog, gray-faced and steady-eyed, who moved without sound and slept where Eli could reach him. There were 3 goats, Bran, Lilt, and Crow, hardy creatures with thick coats and stubborn tempers, better suited to cold than cattle and less fragile than horses. And there were the chickens, tucked into a low coop built against the south side of the hill, their feathers fluffed tight like secrets. No horses. Eli had learned early that horses demanded more than he could give. The valley was not kind to mistakes. The neighbors said the winter would be like any other. They said that every generation thought the cold was worse than the last. They said the land tested everyone, and everyone survived or didn't, and there was no sense worrying before there was proof. Eli listened. He always listened, but he also watched. He watched frost creep deeper into the soil each morning. He watched the goats hesitate before stepping out of their shelter. He watched Moss lift his nose and stare toward the hills long after the wind stopped moving. By early autumn, Eli had made a decision he did not announce. He began digging, not straight down, never straight down. He cut into the hillside where the slope bent just enough to break the wind. He worked with a shovel older than he was and a pick that rang dull against stone. He dug when the sun was high and when it sank low. He dug until his hands split and then wrapped them and dug again. Moss stayed close, always uphill, always watching. The neighbors noticed by the second week. They stopped on the road. They leaned on fences. They asked questions that were not really questions. "What are you making, boy?" Eli did not look up. "A shelter. For what? For what needs it?" They laughed at that. Not cruelly, not at first. Laughter came easy in autumn, when the cold was still a rumor. "You're burying your animals," one man said. "That's backward." Eli tamped soil with the flat of his shovel. "So is the wind." The digging continued. He carved a long chamber into the hill, wide enough for the goats to move freely, tall enough for him to stand without bending. He angled the walls so the earth would hold itself. He lined the floor with stone he hauled from the creek bed, laid by hand, sloped just enough that water would never settle. He built low openings, one near the ground, one near the roofline, though there was barely a roof yet, just beams waiting for weight. He tested them with smoke from a twisted rag, watched how the air moved without forcing it. The earth breathed if you let it. That was something his father had taught him once, long ago, before the valley had taken more than it gave back. By the time the first hard frost came, the shelter was finished. From the outside, it looked like a wound in the hill, rough-edged and unfinished. From the inside, it was quiet. The sound of wind dulled. The air stayed still without becoming heavy. The stone floor held a cool steadiness that did not bite. The goats entered without fear. They sniffed. They stamped. They settled. Moss was last, stepping in only after Eli did, circling once before lying near the entrance, his head on his paws, eyes open. Eli built a front wall from packed earth and timber, thick and simple. He sealed the gaps with clay and straw. He layered sod across the roof beams until grass lay on top like a promise waiting to be kept. The neighbors came again. This time, their voices were sharper. "You're going to suffocate them. You'll trap damp and rot. When the snow piles up, that roof will press down and crush everything inside." Eli answered fewer questions now. He had learned that explanations often fed doubt, instead of easing it. "I'm not fighting the cold," he said once. "I'm stepping aside." Winter arrived early. By the time the river skinned over with ice, the wind had teeth. It stripped warmth from wood and bone alike. The valley emptied of color. Sound carried too far. In the conventional sheds, animals shifted and stamped. Breath smoked and froze along boards. People stuffed cracks with rags. They burned more fuel than they could spare. Eli watched from the hill. Inside the shelter, the goats chewed calmly. The air stayed dry. Water in the trough did not skin over. Moss slept deeper than he ever had before, rising only when Eli moved. Eli kept notes, though no one had asked him to. Morning temperature outside, inside, evening, changes, patterns. The numbers mattered less than the feeling. The way the shelter refused to echo the violence of the wind. The way the cold slowed at the walls and never quite crossed them. By midwinter, the valley was locked tight. Snow fell for days without pause. It did not drift so much as stack, layer upon layer, pressing the land into shapes no one recognized. Fences vanished, paths closed, the road ceased to exist. Eli stayed close to home. The neighbors did not. They fought the storm the way they always had, burning, blocking, bracing. They did not lose animals, not yet, but fear crept in with the cold. The kind of fear that waits quietly and counts hours. One evening, near the deepest part of winter, a man appeared at Eli's door. His name was Tomas Hale. He was older, broad-shouldered, known for speaking plainly and building things that lasted. He did not come to mock. He came to look. They stood together in the shelter, the goats breathing softly between them. "It's warmer," Tomas said, not surprised, just honest. Eli nodded. "It stays." Tomas ran his hand along the earth wall. "You didn't build against the land," he said slowly. "You built into it." That night, the wind howled hard enough to shake the sky. In the valley, roofs groaned. Wood cracked. The cold found every weakness and worried it like a living thing. Inside the hill, Eli slept. Moss did not move. When morning came, the storm had not passed. It had settled in, heavy and relentless, as if testing every choice made before it arrived. Eli stepped outside and felt the cold strike his face like a held breath released all at once. He turned back toward the shelter. Behind him, the hill stood firm. Inside, the animals waited, and somewhere beyond the valley, deeper cold was already moving. The storm did not end. It did not fade or weaken or drift away the way people hoped storms eventually would. It stayed. It pressed itself into the valley and made a home there, reshaping days into something heavy and indistinct. Morning and evening blurred. Time was measured by how often Eli brushed snow from the shelter's entrance and how carefully he counted his animals. The cold sharpened. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It deepened, layer by layer, until even the strongest men in the valley stopped pretending it was ordinary. Eli felt it when he stepped outside each morning. The cold no longer shocked. It settled into his bones and stayed there, quiet and patient. The wind scraped across the snow without lifting it, like a blade dragged flat. Inside the shelter, the air held. The goats rose when Eli entered, not startled, not frantic. Their breath fogged softly and disappeared. Their hooves rested on stone that felt cool but not cruel. Moss followed Eli's movements with his eyes, alert but calm, the way he always was when danger existed but had not crossed the threshold. Eli fed them slowly. He did everything slowly now. Rushing made mistakes. Mistakes in winter were permanent. Outside the hill, the valley began to change. Smoke rose longer from chimneys as people burned through reserves meant to last until spring. The sound of axes carried farther as men cut wood they had hoped to save. The road remained buried, and no one spoke of clearing it anymore. There was nowhere to go. On the fourth day of the deep cold, Tomas Hale returned. He did not come alone. 2 other men walked behind him, faces wrapped, shoulders hunched against the wind. They did not speak until Eli opened the shelter door and the stillness reached them. They stood just inside the entrance, stunned by the quiet. One of them, a younger man named Aaron Pike, pulled his scarf down and breathed out slowly. "It doesn't bite in here," he said, almost to himself. Eli said nothing. He stepped aside. They moved carefully, as if afraid the warmth might break if they walked too hard. Tomas crouched near the floor, pressed his palm against the stone, then the wall. "How deep are you back into the hill?" he asked. Eli told him. "What's above us now?" "Snow," Eli said. "And sod." Aaron glanced up, uneasy. "That much weight. It presses evenly," Eli said. "The hill carries it." No one laughed this time. They stayed longer than Eli expected. They asked about the vents, about moisture, about how often he checked the roof supports. Eli answered each question plainly. He did not oversell. He did not defend. He simply described what was happening. Before they left, Tomas hesitated. "My cattle are holding," he said, "for now, but the barn's bleeding heat. I can feel it when I walk inside, like standing in a broken cup." Eli nodded once. "I didn't come to mock," Tomas added. "I came to understand." That night, the temperature fell again. The wind rose and fell in uneven waves. Snow rattled against buried walls. Somewhere in the valley, wood cracked loudly enough to echo. Eli woke before dawn, heart racing, unsure why. Moss was already standing. They went outside together. The sky was clear in the way that meant danger. Stars burned sharp and close. The cold wrapped itself around Eli's chest when he breathed. He checked the shelter roof by feel, brushing snow from the edge, listening. It did not shift. It did not sigh or creak. The hill held. From across the valley came a sound that did not belong to the wind. A shout, then another. Eli stood still, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. A voice, raw and thin. He followed it. The snow was deep enough to drag at his legs, but the moonlight cut clean lines across the valley, and he knew the ground. He moved carefully, moss ahead of him, stopping often to listen. They found Aaron Pike half buried near a collapsed shed. He was alive, cold, shaking, eyes wide with fear but alive. The shed behind him leaned inward. One wall split where boards had pulled apart. Inside, shapes moved slowly. Animals, alive, pressed together. Eli did not waste time. They dug, they braced, they pulled loose boards free and widened the opening just enough. The cattle inside were stiff but standing, their combined heat the only reason they still breathed. Eli showed Aaron how to block the wind with snow packed tight, how to close gaps without sealing air, how to work fast without panicking. They did not lose a single animal that night. By morning, word had spread. Not loudly, not with celebration, just quietly, from mouth to mouth, like something fragile people were afraid to mishandle. Eli Rowan had animals that were warm, not surviving. Warm. People came in ones and twos, not to praise, to check, to stand inside the shelter and feel the difference with their own bodies. Some left without speaking, others stayed, asking questions they pretended were casual. How long did it take? Would it work for cattle? What if the hill is steeper? Eli answered all of it. The storm reached its worst 3 days later. The cold deepened until metal burned skin on contact. Breath froze on scarves. The valley fell into a silence broken only by the wind and the occasional crack of failing wood. In conventional barns, animals began to falter. Not collapse, not yet, but they stopped moving. They huddled. They spent energy they could not replace. People burned the last of what they had. That evening, Tomas Hale returned again. This time, he brought his daughter. She was 12, wrapped in layers, her eyes too serious for her age. She stood close to her father as they entered the shelter. "It's like the earth is holding its breath," she said. Tomas looked at Eli. "I need help," he said simply. Not advice. Help. They worked through the night. Eli showed him where to dig, even in frozen ground, how to angle cuts so the hill wouldn't fight back, how to start small, a partial shelter, something better than nothing. By dawn, Tomas had a beginning. It wasn't finished. It wouldn't be enough to hold all his animals, but it would hold some, enough to matter. As the storm dragged on, the valley changed again. People stopped laughing entirely. They stopped arguing. They began helping each other without asking why. Eli worked until his hands ached and his shoulders burned. He showed, explained, dug alongside others. Moss moved between people like a quiet sentry, never far from Eli, never in the way. Through it all, the shelter held. The goats grew thicker in coat. The chickens continued laying, slow but steady. Moss slept deeply each night, rising only when Eli did, and still, the storm did not end, but something else had begun. Belief not loud, not proud but growing, like warmth held beneath the ground, waiting for the right moment to rise. The storm ended without ceremony. There was no final roar, no dramatic break. One morning, Eli stepped outside and realized the wind had loosened its grip. The air still burned his lungs, but it no longer pressed him backward. The sky had depth again. The light shifted, thin and pale, but honest. The cold remained, but it was no longer advancing. People emerged slowly from their homes and shelters, as if unsure the land would allow it. Smoke rose straighter from chimneys. Sound returned in fragments, the crunch of boots, the low murmur of voices, the distant call of birds testing the air. The valley looked wounded. Drifts stood taller than fences. Roof lines sagged beneath weight they had not been built to carry. Some sheds leaned at angles that made the eye ache. Paths had to be relearned, dug free by hand. Eli did not celebrate. He checked the shelter first. The goats moved easily, shaking snow dust from their coats, as if winter had been an inconvenience rather than a threat. The chickens rustled softly, feathers smooth, eyes bright. Moss stretched and yawned, then sat, watching Eli with steady patience. The shelter smelled of earth and hay, dry, alive. Eli marked the day in his notebook, then closed it. By midday, people were walking the valley. They did not go everywhere. Everyone knew which places held loss and which did not. They moved carefully, respectful even in their silence. Tomas Hale came late that afternoon. He walked slower than before. Exhaustion settled deep into his shoulders, but there was something else there now. Relief, tempered by understanding. I kept 9 alive, he said. Out of 15, Eli nodded. Without what you showed me, Tomas continued, I'd have lost more. They stood together outside the shelter, looking out across the valley. People are counting now, Tomas said. Not animals. Decisions. Eli felt that settle into him, heavy and unfamiliar. The counting began the next day. Not officially, not with lists posted or numbers announced, but word traveled the way it always did, quietly, honestly, shaped by what could not be argued. Animals sheltered against earth had endured. Animals left to thin walls and open wind had suffered. No one said it aloud at first, but everyone understood. The first meeting happened 3 days later at the general store, once the road had been cleared enough for people to reach it safely. Eli did not plan to go. He had work to do, and attention felt like a distraction. Moss followed him anyway. The store was crowded, not loud, focused. People stood shoulder to shoulder, hats in hand, breath fogging the air. There was no anger in the room, just weight. Tomas spoke first. He did not raise his voice. We did what we've always done, he said, and this winter showed us what that's worth. No one interrupted. We can pretend this was bad luck, he continued, or we can admit that some of us were better prepared than others, not because of strength or stubbornness, but because of how we built. Eyes turned toward Eli. He felt heat rise to his face and looked down. Aaron Pike stepped forward next. His voice shook, but he did not stop. If Eli hadn't come when my shed failed, I'd be counting losses instead of days. He didn't bring miracles. He brought knowledge. A murmur passed through the room. Someone asked the question no one could avoid any longer. Will you help us build? The room went still. Eli looked up slowly. Yes, he said, if you're willing to work. The response was immediate. Not applause. Movement. People stepped closer, already thinking of hillsides and slopes and tools. The work began the next morning. Not all at once. Not recklessly. Eli insisted on patience, on choosing ground carefully, on understanding why each cut mattered. He walked properties with people. He studied soil with them, showed them where water would travel and where it would settle. He explained slope, weight, air movement not as lessons, but as observations. Some listened closely, some nodded without truly hearing. Those who rushed learned quickly. One early shelter collapsed before it was finished. No one was inside. The earth simply reclaimed what had been cut poorly. The lesson spread faster than any warning Eli could have given. They slowed down after that. Winter lingered, but it no longer ruled. Days lengthened by minutes at a time. Snow softened at the edges. Drips formed where ice had once seemed permanent. By late winter, 3 new earth-backed shelters stood in the valley. They were not elegant. They were not identical. But they worked. People noticed the difference immediately. Inside those shelters, animals stood calm. Feed consumption dropped. Water remained liquid longer. People slept better knowing the night was not stealing warmth inch by inch. Eli worked until exhaustion forced him to stop. Moss remained at his side, silent and constant. The goats grew restless as daylight returned, eager to test the world again. The chickens scratched eagerly at the first exposed soil. One evening, Eli found Tomas's daughter sitting near the shelter entrance, sketching in the snow with a stick. "What are you drawing?" Eli asked. "The hill," she said, "but open." He crouched beside her, studied the lines. She had drawn layers, soil, stone, air. "Why?" he asked. "So I remember," she said. "When I'm older." The words stayed with him longer than he expected. By early spring, the valley looked different, not healed, changed. Hillsides bore new cuts, careful and deliberate. Roofs sprouted sod. People spoke less about fighting winter and more about preparing for it. There was no monument, no declaration, just work. One afternoon, a man Eli did not recognize arrived from beyond the valley. He had heard rumors, he said. Stories about shelters that stayed warm without fire. He walked through Eli's shelter slowly, touching nothing, observing everything. "This isn't new," the man said finally. "It's old." Eli nodded. "Old things last." The man left without another word. As spring finally loosened winter's grip, people began planning ahead, not for next month, for next year. They gathered tools. They marked hillsides. They argued gently about slope and depth and drainage. Eli found himself answering questions he had never thought to ask himself before. Why does this work? Because the earth does not change quickly. Because heat moves slowly through mass. Because shelter is not defiance, it is cooperation. One evening, as the sun dipped low and snowmelt traced quiet paths through the valley, Eli stood at the shelter entrance with Moss beside him. The land was still, not silent, settled. Behind him, warmth held. Ahead of him, a valley that had learned something painful and necessary. Winter would return. He knew that, but it would not arrive to the same valley again. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in pauses, in afternoons where the sun lingered longer than expected, in snow that softened instead of cutting. In the first day, Eli realized his breath no longer burned his chest when he stepped outside. The valley breathed again. Water traced paths through the thawed ground, finding channels old and new. Hillsides darkened where earth showed through. The goats tested the edges of their patience, climbing higher each day, noses lifted to scents that had been buried for months. The shelter changed with the season. What had been a refuge from cold became a place of rest, a place of return. The earth walls stayed cool now, steady against warming air. The roof grew green where sod took hold fully. grass thickening as if the hill itself were healing around the cut. People noticed. They did not say much. They did not need to. Work continued, even as the urgency faded. Not frantic digging now, but planning, adjusting, improving. Some shelters were expanded, others were reshaped. A few were abandoned and rebuilt when people realized they had rushed their understanding. Eli helped where he could. He never took charge. He never stood at the center of anything. He walked alongside, shovel in hand, answering questions when asked and stepping back when others found their own answers. Moss aged quietly that spring. His muzzle lightened further. His steps slowed just enough to be noticeable only to Eli. He still worked, still watched, but he rested more often now, choosing patches of sun near the shelter wall instead of the hilltop. Eli noticed. He always noticed. The valley held a gathering in late spring, not a celebration, a sharing. People brought food. They stood outside, letting the wind move freely now that it no longer carried teeth. Children ran between adults, laughter careful at first, then louder as confidence returned. Someone asked Eli to speak. He declined. Tomas spoke instead. "This winter took something from all of us," Tomas said, "but it also taught us something. We learned that survival isn't about being tougher than the land. It's about listening to it." Heads nodded, eyes turned toward the hills, toward the quiet shapes built into them. Summer followed. The shelters faded into the background of daily life. They were no longer strange. They were simply there, doing their work without demanding attention. Animals thrived. Not dramatically, normally, which was the point. Eli's days returned to a rhythm that felt familiar, but not the same. There was less strain in it now, less fear waiting at the edge of each task. He repaired fences. He traded knowledge with neighbors. He listened more than he spoke. One afternoon, Tomas's daughter returned with her sketches. She had drawn more than hills this time. People, animals, lines showing airflow, layers of earth. "You remember," Eli said. She nodded. "I will." The years passed. The shelters endured. Winters came again, hard ones, mild ones, but none caught the valley unprepared. Each year, people refined what they had learned. They adjusted angles, improved drainage, thought ahead. Eli grew into himself without noticing. His hands hardened. His shoulders broadened. His face settled into something steady. He took on more land, not because he wanted more, but because others trusted him with it. Moss lived a long life. He passed quietly one evening beneath the shelter roof, head resting against the earth wall, breath slowing until it stopped without struggle. Eli buried him on the hill above, where the wind could pass freely and the ground stayed warm beneath the surface. The goats lived out their days in comfort. The chickens continued to scratch and lay and cluck at nothing in particular. Time did what time always does. People came and went from the valley. Some stayed, some moved on, but the shelters remained. They became part of the land's language, understood without explanation. One winter, long after the boy had become a man, the cold came early again, not cruel, just honest. Newer families worried. Older ones did not. Eli stood at the shelter entrance as snow began to fall, watching it settle without hurry. He felt the familiar stillness wrap around him, the earth holding steady beneath his feet. He thought of the first hole he had dug, of the laughter, of the doubt, of the quiet that followed when proof arrived without argument. The land did not care who learned first. It only cared who learned well. Eli stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The earth breathed, and it held. Years later, people would forget the order of events. They would forget how long the cold lasted, or which storm had broken first. They would argue gently about details, the depth of the snow, the way the wind sounded at night, whether the fear had come suddenly or crept in over weeks. But they would not forget what changed. The valley looked ordinary to strangers. That was the strange part. Hills rose and fell the way hills always had. Grass-covered slopes that once bore scars from careful digging. From a distance, Nothing marked the difference between before and after. Only those who lived there knew where to look. A line in the hill that curved too evenly. A roof that stayed green longer into winter. A doorway set low, angled against the wind, its threshold worn smooth by years of passing feet and hooves. Shelters did not announce themselves. They did not need to. Children grew up thinking the valley had always been built this way, that animals belonged partly to the land, not set against it. That warmth came from planning, not desperation. When they asked why the shelters were shaped the way they were, adults gave simple answers. Because the earth keeps its promises. They did not mention Eli Rowan at first. Not because he was forgotten, but because what he did had stopped feeling like something done by one person. It had become part of how things were understood. Eli lived his life without spectacle. He did not leave the valley. He did not seek recognition beyond it. He worked. He taught when asked. He listened when he was wrong. When he grew older, he walked the hills more slowly. He rested more often. He still paused at certain places, feeling the ground beneath his feet, as if checking whether it still remembered. It always did. On quiet evenings, when the light faded gently and the air cooled without threat, Eli would sit near the shelter entrance and watch the land settle into itself. He could feel the stored warmth behind him, steady and patient. That steadiness had outlasted storms. It outlasted doubt. It outlasted him. After he was gone, the valley continued much as it always had. Winters came. Summers followed. New families arrived, drawn by land that seemed kinder than others. They learned quickly, because the valley itself taught them. Dig where the wind cannot reach. Let the earth help you. Do not build as if you are alone. And so the shelters remained. Not monuments, not relics, just quiet proof that listening to land, to weather, to hard-earned experience was sometimes enough to change everything. Long after names blurred and stories shortened, warmth still held beneath the hills, and the valley endured.